Hello, ohayou gozaimasu, and welcome to part 3 of my anatomy of the Makioka Sisters. I've already looked at the novel in some detail and Ichikawa's 1983 film adaptation, and I thought to truly set this video apart from other such analyses which have been undertaken both in writing and in video analysis, such as I'm doing here, I would attempt to set Ichikawa's film in some kind of context. There were, in the 1950s, two fairly major adaptations of the Makioka Sisters. One in 1950, just after the novel had completed its publication run, being serialized, which was 1948. That was directed by Abe Yutaka. And in 1958, a film adaptation, a condensed adaptation, but nonetheless an interesting one, by Shima Koji. Neither of those two directors are ones whose names will mean much to many outside of Japan, at least, or unless you are a hardened Japanese cinephile. So I'll say something about their respective work and say something about those two films. And I will also endeavour to explore something of how the subject and themes of the Makioka Sisters were explored in other films. I mean, the Shomingeki, or home drama, of which Ozu and Naruse were the preeminent figures at this time, has significant overlap with the Makioka Sisters. And indeed, there were films revolving entirely around sisters, as well as around subjects such as arranged marriages and the pressures on young women to marry, which was a recurrent sort of narrative motif in Ozu's work. So I'll say something about all of these and hopefully elucidate a little bit more, in so doing, Ichikawa's approach to these themes in the 1980s, significantly later, but nonetheless in a way that sort of rhymes with some of these key themes. Let us remind ourselves that the golden age of Japanese cinema, the perceived golden age of Japanese cinema, or a perceived golden age, if you hold to the view that there were earlier ones, was the 1950s. And this was the time that Ichikawa's work began, that his career as a director began. He began making films around this time in the late 1940s. So he sort of came of age at this time. So he has one foot in the social, political, cultural milieu that initially gave rise to both direct adaptations of the Makioka Sisters and indeed to these other films, these related films that, as I said, have significant overlap with the same. So let's dive into this context and round out our analysis of Ichikawa's The Makioka Sisters. Perhaps the best place to start here is to stress the, in some cases, very obvious connective tissues between the Makioka Sisters as adaptations of Tanizaki's novel, as I've said, two of which appeared in the first decade after it had completed its serialization, and other films that were prominent and preeminent in Japanese cinema around that particular time. We're talking about the late 40s and the 50s, the perceived golden age of Japanese cinema. I've already mentioned that There were two film adaptations in 50 and 58 respectively. Alongside these were other films that shared themes and, in a lot of cases, subject matter with Tanizaki's novel and the treatment thereof in these two films. So we had, for instance, in 1950, an Ozu Yasujiro film called the Munekata Sisters, about two sisters. And in 1954, a film entitled Five Sisters. In the Munekata Sisters and Five Sisters, there appears in a key role Tanaka Kinuyo. And in effect here, Tanaka Kinuyo is playing the Tsuruko role in both films. She plays in both Five Sisters and the Munekata Sisters the eldest of the sisters, the one who is in some ways the mother hen of younger siblings, who has to balance out living separately, not seeing as much of her siblings as perhaps she would like, but also taking on board some of the key responsibilities for continuing the family name, the family reputation, although in neither the Munekata Sisters or Five Sisters is there anything like the sense of an established, traditional, once wealthy industrial family. But nonetheless, because of missing parents, in one way or another, the Tanaka Kinuyo character in both Ozu's film and in Five Sisters is the responsible sort of quasi-parent, if you like. Now, beyond this, one key connection is the presence of Takamine Hideko. Now, right around this time, Takamine had begun to essay young female characters who were quite willful, quite flighty, in some ways subversive with regard to frustrating quite openly what was expected of them with regard to the family and with regard to the social fabric. In films like Ichikawa Kon's 365 Nights, in Ozu's The Munekata Sisters, which was made the very same year as the adaptation of the Makioka Sisters, the first, in which Takamine plays Taeko, in something like Kinoshita Keisuke's Carmen Comes Home, all singing, all dancing, Technicolor film in which Takamine plays a kind of exotic nightclub dancer who caught scandal in her native village. She plays characters who are fairly, as I said, strong-minded, willful, quite openly desirous of going their own way. So this is something that was very much part of this actress's image at this time, and thus her casting as Taeko is very much on point with how she was developing as an actress during largely the post-war years. What I think we see with this particular adaptation of the Makioka Sisters by director Abe Yutaka, who was himself at this point directing comparable dramas, romantic and otherwise, is a sense that it fits into the developing works of its key stars and its director and indeed its studio, and captures something of a sort of zeitgeist, in the sense that it is exploring themes that socially, but particularly culturally, were incredibly prominent at the time. The notion of arranged marriages and the weight on young women to marry by a certain age was already a subject that Ozu had made at least one great film about, Late Spring, and would go on to make several more. And it had variously cropped up in Naruse films and Shimazu films and other works by key Shomingeki directors, home drama directors. There is another connection in terms of the cast, a very direct connection between the 1950 and 1958 versions of the Makioka Sisters, and that is the presence of the actress Todoroki Yukiko, who plays Sachiko in the 1950 film, and Tsuruko, the eldest sister, in the 1958 film. Possibly by the late 1950s, the fact that she was married to the director of the 1958 version, Shima Koji, may suggest something of why she was cast in that film. But she was, albeit she would pass away at a fairly young age, so she didn't work much into the late 1960s at least. She was a fairly major star in the 1950s, and the fact that we have Sachiko in the one film becoming Tsuruko in the later film tells us quite a lot about how, even in so short a period as 8 years, changes have been wrought that have impacted on how this material has been viewed and how it's been appropriated. So what we have in effect here is the characterization of Sachiko in 1950 kind of hardening into Tsuruko by the end of the decade, suggesting something of the extent to which the personality traits, the actions and attitudes of Sachiko, as I've mentioned many times, as the sort of central consciousness of the whole narrative. The fact that she would sort of, as I said, harden or petrify into the more hard-heartedness of Tsuruko suggests something about how we judge characters in the context in which they live, that inevitably identity is shaped by wider forces, if you like. I believe that the connection in the casting of Todoroki also suggests something that leads me to address the point about what the import of all this is for Ichikawa's film, which is that the 1950 and 1958 versions of the Makioka Sisters are very similar in many ways, and the changes that Ichikawa brought to the 1983 version in effect distance his film from these two 1950s adaptations. So I mentioned in my other videos on the Makioka Sisters that Ichikawa-kon downplays the sense of exteriority, the sense of the world without the Makioka household impinging on the fortunes of said household and its constituent characters and family members. This occurs much more often in the novel, especially through the recurrence of natural disasters, and it is something that the earliest adaptations both hew themselves to. So in particular, the flood early in the narrative that is so instrumental in shaping Taiko's trajectory is retained and dramatised in both the 1950 version and the 1958 version. And I think, given that this is such a key point in this character's life, there's also a sense in both of these films, given that the most overt change, I think, occurs in Taiko's life, that this is actually the protagonist, that she is the central character in both of these films, the youngest, the one who is more rebellious but who undergoes the most dramatic change. There's a sense that she is the protagonist, she is the central consciousness, whereas, as I've said, it's more Sachiko in Ichikawa's film. So again, the sense with what Ichikawa does in removing any of these natural disasters and foregrounding Sachiko's consciousness, because, as I've argued elsewhere, I think there's a sense that she embodies the thematic heart of the material. Even though Taiko goes from being rebellious to being ultimately pregnant and getting herself married, there's still a sense that she is kind of accepting of the change from being more liberal to more conservative, if you like, whereas Sachiko is still trying to reconcile these two opposing states, and that is something that Ichikawa really clings onto and dramatizes really well and subtly, and it's something that neither of the earlier two adaptations really crystallize or explore in any great detail. These two earlier adaptations were both made at different studios. Shin Toho, the 1950 version, a very new studio at the time, and therein, 1958. And then obviously, as I've said, Toho was key with Ichikawa's production. One of the key reasons for this, I think, is that this became a kind of means for different studios to stamp something of their own sort of signature, if you like, more than an authorial signature, which is what we get with Ichikawa. We get two directors who I don't think anyone would consider auteurs in Abe Yutaka and Shima Koji, working to the dictates of studio filmmaking. Shima had, just before, he was a director who had made dramas before, but he sort of migrated here and there between quite diverse genres. So the fact that the Dai film was made in colour, part of Shima getting the gig was that he had only just made Japan's first science fiction film in colour, a film you may well have seen, a film called Warning from Space, a sort of cheap and cheerful Japanese response to or version of the great Hollywood film The Day the Earth Stood Still. So he got this this sense of using colour dramatically in a genre context, and to be fair to him, he does use colour well in his version of the Makioka Sisters. Daiei at the time, it had been a famous studio for trying to pander to, in a certain sense, an international audience. So Mizoguchi had made several films there in the early 50s, and the fact of using colour, I think, bespeaks something of its desire to use this sort of framework against black and white in order to suggest something stylized and, in a sense, exotic as a means of capitalizing on an international appetite, or a perceived international appetite post Rashomon, for the exotic from Japan, for the colourful, for a kind of Orientalist sensibility, thinking about what is represented by Japanese culture. With regard to Daiei Studios, the studio behind Shima Koji's The Makioka Sisters, they were always the studio that had the keenest eye and arguably the firmest desire to capitalise on the Western market. So the colour version of the Makioka Sisters, given the constant presence of either the material itself or very similar material, as I've argued, makes sense. There was also a sense that the studio was moving into a sense of national prestige at this time, as there had been other adaptations, either of canonical legends and theatrical narrative like the Loyal 47 Ronin, or of other celebrated works of literature, such as Masumura Yasuzo's adaptation of Kawabata Yasunari's Thousand Cranes, which was made very shortly after. So the sense of a studio imperative behind these two early adaptations is key. And again, I think although there is a studio imperative with Toho, obviously, given the celebrations that were marked by Ichikawa's The Makioka Sisters, nonetheless, I think the fact that it was a studio that was wanting to sort of change its image to an extent, or break new ground, means that there was more license that could be taken by the director. So it's Ichikawa's film is much more of an authorial work, and Ichikawa's, as I said, license, the fact that he could fly in the face of what these earlier films had done, particularly what they'd left out and what they'd included, which Ichikawa reverses. He makes Sachiko more central. He keeps the narrative more interior. The fact that he could do that suggests a much more authorial imperative. The point of all this then is to stress that, much like Sachiko herself, who is more of a protagonist here, as I've noted, Ichikawa's The Makioka Sisters looks backward and looks forward. There isn't the hesitancy or uncertainty that characterises Sachiko's trajectory throughout Ichikawa's film, but that sense of being at the crux or at the heart of a certain fractious line or through line from past through present and into the future is in a way characteristic of this film itself, which is looking back to a time in the 1950s when this particular novel was very popular, when adaptations were rife, and more broadly when the themes it explores and the genres that it touches on were commonplace, and is projecting that into a present and potentially a future where none of those contextual factors hold firm. And I think the reason for this is that Ichikawa wants to ask what the value of this material is in an entirely new age, an entirely new era in Japanese society, politics, and indeed culture. As I've said, the film industry at this time was on its knees at best. Studios were beginning to fold. The film industry really was crumbling around the ears of directors like Ichikawa and other notable figures like Kurosawa, whose key films in this decade were all produced through international co-productions and international capital, and likewise Oshima. Films like Max Mon Amour were similarly international co-productions. These major directors were not able to realize projects entirely within Japan. And the fact that Ichikawa could is testament to his vision and to the ongoing relevance and resonance of this material. But we have to ask what it means to the 1980s. He doesn't update the setting. This is a film that retains the time frame and the period as it is, or was it that it was more pronouncedly in the 1980s, the period setting. So what can looking at the 30s and 40s and indeed 50s with these intertextual nods in mind tell us about the 1980s? And that's something that I think floats throughout this film. It's bubbling continuously under the surface, this tension, and perhaps that sense of distance that I've talked about, and the sense of thematizing notions of looking and perceiving and presuming, all factors into this particular thematic and stylistic model. Okay, I really hope that you've all enjoyed this three-part deep dive into the Makioka Sisters. Do let me know what you think. Please leave comments. Argue with me, disagree with me, and let's have a dialogue. Let's talk. Follow me on X at AdamBingham01 and online at culturaljapan.com. A lot of my videos and online blogs and reviews tie into one another, so you'll find there's a hopefully enriching relationship between the two. Otherwise, thanks again. Stay tuned for more videos in the very near future. Bye for now.